All right, everyone, welcome back. Welcome back to the second session. This was meant to be, shall we say, hosted by Stephen Dziedzic, but he's had a work disaster that he might tell you all about when he rushes in about 15 minutes. At the moment, he's in an Uber on his way from Parliament House. But so I will kick off the session and moderate myself. So we have a very interesting session or very interesting bunch of panelists for this session. I won't go into great introductions. You probably are familiar with many of them already. I think I'm tempted to throw to Transform first because Transform is in Sols, and having him up there is wonderful, but we can never be 100% sure of how long we'll have him up there just because of the way things go. So I will throw over to Transform, who is at the moment as at Solomon Islands National University, but has an incredibly distinguished career, particularly in fisheries management and fisheries research throughout the Pacific. He's really, for me, one of the people I go to when I want to get something straight about Solomons and about the region more generally. So his chapter, I don't have the book in front of me, unfortunately, but his chapter was a very interesting think piece written before Solomon Islands switched from Taiwan to China, arguing quite strongly that Solomon Islands, by all means, should switch to China, but it wasn't ready at the present time. And obviously, we had to revise the chapter somewhat because the switch happened after he'd written the chapter. And it is a really fascinating think piece on what these kind of changes in geopolitics mean at the level of governance for a Pacific Island state. So I'll throw quickly to you, Transform. For all of our speakers, try to keep it brief because we have many questions, and Stephen, when he arrives, is sure to have his own as well.
Just last week, I had the wonderful opportunity of having lunch with the former Prime Minister, whose party was the one who vouched the switch. And I was able to learn, actually get some really inside information as to how the switch happened. Of course, when I wrote the chapter, it was not envisaged that there would be a switch, although one of the former Prime Minister Ricky Ho had canvassed that. And apparently, what happened was when they were putting together the coalition after the election, there was that one particular sentence in his party's manifesto that they put up, and that was that they did not say there was going to be a switch. They said they would consider a switch. But I think there was, from what I understand from our conversation, there was a lot of pressure because of the close relationship between Guadalcanal and Guangdong province. And therefore, I think one of the current ministers who is very influential in the government, he was the one who was very strong behind the switch. And apparently, they were going to go through due process as well, but he was also the one who was very strong behind the push. So as these things happen in island politics, there is never any certainty. So I had envisaged that it was not a question of if, but it was always going to be a question of when. But maybe it was more the manner in which it was done, which is causing a lot of strife and internal issues. But we've got the foreign minister arriving this evening, so the dynamics have changed, and I think we have to learn to live with the new dynamics with China as a major player and partner in Solomon Islands development, as are Australia and the United States and the other parts of it. Thanks, Graeme.
I'm running 8 minutes late, which is a disaster. So I really do apologise because I know that people here, their time is valuable. And I really do apologise for being late. There was an urgent work matter that came up. So I apologise for that. I don't want you to think that I take this lightly or heedlessly. All right, Graeme, hello.
Hello.
I
Lovely to see you.
apologise again. Lovely to see you too. Can I ask where we're up to, just so I don't repeat myself in any way? Have we just begun?
Yeah, so Transform's just given his
All
opening
right.
remarks. So we have Sandra, Denghua, and myself.
Yes,
In
great.
your-
Well, perhaps I go to Sandra next, just for some further opening remarks, and then we'll go to Denghua after that.
Yeah, sounds good.
Apologies again to you, Sandra, Dr. Tarte. Can I just ask you if there's any sort of opening observations you'd like to make before we get into the guts of this discussion?
Thank you, and welcome. Good afternoon, everybody, and thank you for inviting me to this. Is it clear, loud and clear?
Yeah.
Okay. I do have a few prepared remarks, and hopefully it'll be within the 5 minutes. So reflecting on Fiji-China relations in the past few years, I would suggest that the trends that were emerging at the time I wrote that chapter have continued, and if anything, become more pronounced. The decade that I covered in my chapter was 2008 to 2018. And this is a period that saw a substantial strengthening of the bilateral relationship. China definitely became Fiji's best friend. But following the return to elected government in 2014, there began a rebalancing of sorts as traditional partners moved to restore and rebuild ties. This was a trend very much welcomed and encouraged by Fiji. Related to that, there began a corresponding diminution in the relative importance to Fiji of the China relationship. Now, since 2018, I think we've seen an acceleration of that trend. This is especially in the security domain, with Australian, New Zealand, and US support for peacekeeping and disaster response, as well as maritime surveillance and enforcement. But it has also been visible in the economic and the COVID response domains. This year alone, we have seen a stream of very high-level visits from Australia, New Zealand, and the US. There's also been the second visit to Fiji by a Japanese foreign minister in under 3 years, after a gap of 32 years, I might add. In addition to the Vuvale partnership with Australia, we now have the Duavata partnership with New Zealand. On the other hand, while trade with China has grown in recent years, and wood chip exports in particular have been marked, we have not seen the growth in investment, trade, and tourism that was there previously. COVID, of course, has taken its toll, particularly on tourism. The only tourists now coming back here are our near neighbors, Australia and New Zealand. Also, some investment projects have remained stalled or mired in controversy. The Fiji High Court recently fined one Chinese developer a record 1 million Fijian dollars after it was found guilty of causing substantial and irreversible harm to the coastal environment on Malolo Island after undertaking unauthorized development. The COVID pandemic, I would also say, has been a significant factor in shaping the Fiji-China relationship, but in more ways than one. I would argue that the trends that I described earlier have been augmented by COVID. The highly visible vaccine donations that helped Fiji emerge from the pandemic late last year and start its recovery were mainly provided by our traditional Western partners, New Zealand, Australia, the US, and Japan, some directly and others through COVAX and in partnership with UNICEF. On the other hand, the Chinese government was not such a visible or prominent player when it came to dealing with the COVID pandemic. It did, of course, provide some support, such as PPE and other supplies, as well as cash, all gratefully acknowledged. But the emphasis was on humanitarian grant aid, as well as aid to the Republic of Fiji military forces, not on vaccines. And I'll come back to this. Now, I posed the question at the end of my chapter: how will China respond to these changing dynamics in relations with Fiji, where other partners are now outbidding and outshining China? Will it up the ante? My initial impressions are that that does not appear to be happening, despite continued rhetoric about pushing the partnership to new levels, coming from the China side, that is. We had the virtual China Pacific Island countries foreign ministers meeting last October, which Prime Minister Bainimarama attended. Apart from that, we've also had the high-level meeting, which was the two leaders' phone conversation, Xi and Bainimarama, last June. But there were no big pronouncements relating to the bilateral relationship. I would suggest that the focus of both sides has been on consolidation of the partnership. For China, it is important that Fiji continues to stand by the One China policy and also support it on other core national interests, support that Fiji has generally provided, except on the South China Sea. For both sides, there continues to be reference to the BRI. Fiji's Prime Minister has reaffirmed his government's intention to actively participate in the BRI. What that actually means in practice is not clear, and I look forward to Henrik's paper later in this session. Apart from exploring and exploiting economic opportunities, I think what's important for Fiji is coordination with China on key international agendas, and the most important one being, of course, climate change. But beyond that, I think Fiji would agree with the Federated States of Micronesia President's sentiments expressed last year after the China-Pacific Island Foreign Ministers meeting on the need for the US and China to work together to help fix climate change, as he put it. The security relationship with China has not been so high profile lately, but one notable development was the appointment by China in late 2020 of its first defense attaché based in the Chinese embassy in Fiji, a senior colonel in the People's Liberation Army, who plans to fast track defense cooperation between the PLA and the RFMF. As mentioned earlier, China has supplied COVID response assistance as well as vehicles to the RFMF. And I would say on reflection, given the critical logistical role that the RFMF played in implementing the Fiji government's COVID response, this support from the Chinese side was probably quite significant. Apart from PLA RFMF ties, there's also been enhanced police cooperation between the two countries. This was underscored by the appointment late last year of a Chinese police liaison officer based in Fiji. And this was within the framework of the 2011 MOU between the Fijian police and China's Ministry of Public Security. While we have not seen any repeats of the 2017 joint operation between the Chinese and the Fijian police, when Chinese nationals who were suspected of involvement in online fraud were deported en masse to China, we have seen efforts to boost protection for the overseas Chinese community in Fiji from local criminal activities. Last December, there was a public forum held in Suva with the Chinese embassy, the overseas Chinese community, and the Fijian police force after a particularly brazen and violent robbery took place in a rural area. And this, I think this cooperation will certainly continue to be a focus of concern. I'd just like to conclude with a reference to the forthcoming general elections in Fiji. There is a possibility that if there is a change of government to one involving Sitiveni Rambuka and Biman Prasad, such a government will be less inclined towards China. Both leaders have spoken out in the past against Fiji's close relationship with China, criticizing China's human rights record, its lack of support for democracy, and its suspected strategic ambitions. They've also been critical, I'd say, of the way Western partners have re-engaged with the Bainimarama government. Obviously, the relationship with China is a crucial one for Fiji and will continue to be so. But how close the political and security partnership remains is less certain. For now, the government is pursuing a pragmatic course, as described in my chapter. It is making decisions based on its calculations of Fiji's national interests and taking maximum advantage of the region's changing external environment. Thank you.
Thanks, Sandra. Really appreciate it. Denghua, we might go to you next, if that's all right, just for a brief opening remark.
So first of all, I want to thank Graeme and Terence for organizing this event, and also thank you, Stephen, for chairing this session. And for my book chapter, it focused on Chinese foreign aid in the Pacific, and especially the newly established the CITCA, the China International Development Cooperation Agency. So I just want to take this opportunity to provide a very quick update. And the first is that looking at what the CITCA has been doing since its creation in April 2018, we can say that it has continued the Chinese old policy. And also in recent years, what CITCA has been doing is drafting the regulations, changing the name from MOFCOM to CITCA, and also drafting regulations on the management of the Chinese foreign aid, and also including the use of the China aid, the logo. And also they have focused largely on the internal setup Yeah, because it's a new agency. And in terms of the influence or the power struggle between different agencies, different ministries in China in relation to Chinese foreign aid management, we can see that since the creation of CITCA, the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, they have increased their influence. That means they have more influence in terms of the Chinese foreign aid, the policy making and delivery. And foreign aid has been increasingly used as a diplomatic tool for China in recent years. And in the context of the COVID-19, the pandemic, we can see that CITCA has focused largely on the COVID-related aid delivery in the past 2 years. And also, it's not surprising that the Belt and Road Initiative, BRI, continue to anchor the Chinese foreign aid delivery. That means the Chinese government continue to use foreign aid program to support the rollout of BRI projects overseas, including in the Pacific region. And it's very interesting to look at the 10 highlights of CITCA for the year 2021. For example, the number 1 highlight is about the COVID-related, the aid delivery. And the third one is about the support of BRI. And number 4 is quite interesting. I want to highlight here is that the Chinese aid agency said they are going to further promote what they call the small but beautiful projects, which include the fungus grass projects in Fiji and Papua New Guinea. It's interesting I think the reason why that the Chinese aid agency CITCA is highlighting this type of the small but beautiful projects, including the grass project in the Pacific, is that because they said this project was first initiated when the President Xi Jinping was the governor in Fujian province. And this fungus grass project actually has been leading by the Fujian Agriculture and Forestry University. Yeah. And so this is the reason why they are promoting this project. And also in terms of the Chinese foreign aid projects, there are also some other developments. For example, the Chinese side, they donated 20 school buses to Kiribati, especially to the outer islands in April 2022 this year. And also they announced that they are going to provide 10 government scholarships to Kiribati for the year 2022 to 2023. And I think it's also important to talk about the China Solomon Islands engagement. And we can see that the China Solomon Islands engagement and cooperation has been really impressive in terms of scope and areas. They cover a lot of areas such as security compact, which we have mentioned briefly, and also it also covers the meetings between the Chinese ambassador and also the governors from the outer islands provinces, and also include the building or establishment of the sister-city relationship, and also including even the donation of some materials and the supplies to the Malaita province in Solomon Islands, and also the policing, the cooperation, and also the China funded the sports stadium in Honiara. So we can see that this type of the bilateral engagement between China and the Solomon Islands has been really impressive in recent years. And another aspect I think we can discuss more during the Q&A is the Chinese foreign minister's visit to the whole region. And it said the Chinese foreign minister is going to visit eight Pacific Island countries, and then have those that should be the virtual meetings with the leaders from the rest of the three, from FSM and Cook Islands and the Niue. And I think we can discuss more in the Q&A about this. And I will stop here. Thank you.
Great, thank you. Graeme, lucky last. And apologies again for my lateness to you as well. do you want to give a very quick overview of anything, or do you want to dive straight into questions? Or are there any observations you'd like to draw out from some of the first comments made from
Look, I've got a quiz for you, so I know. I'm going to put you on the spot as you've come here in person. You're foolish enough to do that. You were trying to stay online. Like, get over here. So the question is, this was sent to me this morning, and the game is pick the author. So this is a forthcoming book, and pick the PNG bureaucrat, because I know you're very big on your PNG bureaucrats. And I'm using this because it's sort of a hook into my chapter, which is about migration to the region, which is my pet subject. Most of what I look at is looking at Chinese companies investing in the region, but I find the migrants endlessly fascinating. So this is a vignette from the Hot Rooster Fried Chicken shop in Booker in Bougainville. It was Friday lunchtime and trade was brisk. Bougainvillians at the kitchen broilers taking out fried chicken and chips and shoveling them into yellow and green boxes, while the young Chinese proprietor in a web singlet straight out of an 80s Pet Shop Boys video cross-checked each cash transaction and performed by the unhappy-looking counter staff. Unusually, he wasn't sitting on a high chair. In other stores in Booker, the Chinese sat on high chairs so they could watch over the tills like a tennis umpire at the net. Observing the workaday process as we waited, I couldn't help but think how Chinese migrants were pioneering types. For all the fevered yellow peril talk that occasionally bubbled up in the Australian media, I often thought Chinese traders in outposts like Booker were more in the business of trying to scratch out a living than quarrying away with malign intent. Unlike me, they didn't have the prospect of a flight out every now and then. They were hardier stock. Quote, "That's the problem with you white men," a Papua New Guinea bureaucrat who headed a government department told me once. "You're not prepared to do the hard work. You guys want toilet paper. The Chinese will happily wipe their ass with a leaf." So,
no way.
Oh, pick the author and pick the bureaucrat.
No, that's way too incriminating. I am genuinely curious though.
So the author's Gordon Pete,
Yeah.
forthcoming book, and the bureaucrat, I didn't guess it either, although he was, in my mind, Eric Kwa, a very funny man. Droll indeed. So look, to update things, I guess the only fieldwork I've really done since I wrote the chapter was to go to Solomon Islands. And there was one thing that went down there that was quite germane, and that was in a chat with Peter Kamiluri Jr. And it was sort of at the time when the switch was a sort of a fevered topic of conversation around the latte bars.
Yeah.
And he said it was extraordinary. Whenever he went into a Chinese shop, or often when he went to a Chinese shop, the shopkeeper would pull him aside and say, "We really like your policy." And he'd be scratching his head going, I didn't know you guys followed policy development in Solomon Islands, but what policy are you talking about? And they would say, "Oh, your policy on Taiwan. We want Taiwan to stay." And he was very puzzled about this, like, your Chinese shopkeepers, like, surely you should want to have an embassy, like, it's convenient for you, you don't need to go to PNG to get your passport. And they said, "Oh no, it would be terrible if China came here, really bad, really bad." And from my digging that week, there were a few rationales from them. One was they were frontier types, as described there, and they didn't want their government keeping an eye on them. And two, Chinese recognition, or in the form of an embassy, would lead to more Chinese migrants and thus more competition. Indeed. So I'll leave it there, but I encourage you to read my chapter. It's about migration. There's also two other chapters in the volume by Patrick Matbold and Mika Beretta Suarez in Timor-Leste, and they are both about the migration experience in the Pacific for Chinese diaspora. It's a really complicated question, but I'm sure we will get to it with Stephen's questions.
No, this is great. Now, I'm actually going to pull out a line. I reread the chapters last night, and there was one there was a line I thought that was germane, to use your word, Graeme, that just struck me. It's actually from Sandra's piece. And Sandra, this is when you were talking about the China-Fiji relationship, obviously, and China's increasing influence, so forth in Fiji. And you basically say that, I'll quote directly, "The analysis suggests that Fiji has proactively exploited opportunities within this partnership while maintaining and exercising its autonomy and agency." But then there's another one. I think you might actually be quoting Wesley Smith, is it right? I'm not sure. Oh, yes. This reflects a broader point made by Dr. Wesley Smith. Most commentators struggle to identify any coherent policy in Beijing regarding Oceania, let alone a grand strategy driven by hegemonic aspirations. I think that might be a direct quote. Now, I'm not sure how old that quote is, but obviously with Wang Yi visiting no fewer than 8 countries in the region over the coming 10 or perhaps 11 days, including Timor-Leste, which is one that I at least didn't necessarily see coming. I might start with you, Sandra, given I've quoted from your piece. Do you think that contention that it is difficult to discern any sort of hegemonic grand strategy from China holds? Do you believe that your assessment that Pacific Island nations are largely very adept and totally capable of navigating both the opportunities and pitfalls that Chinese interest provides remains? What reflections, if any, do you have on the scope and scale of Wang Yi's trip approaching this week? Do you think it signals anything? And if it does, what does it signal? And then I might come to the others with some similar related questions.
Thank you. I actually obviously would prefer not to try and talk about the whole region or all the other countries. I think it varies quite considerably. And, you know, some countries are in a much better position to be proactive and, if anything, autonomous actor in their relationship with China. I think with Fiji and China, there are some special aspects here, and these are not necessarily replicated across the region. And I think it has given Fiji that perhaps more autonomy and leverage, if you like, with China. And it's also made it possible for Fiji to choose when and how to engage with China, recognizing there are things China offers and can bring to the table, and there are things that others can do better.
Can I jump in there, Sandra? I might just, about 2 weeks ago, an Australian official government person, without being specific, said that there was a real sense in their assessment, a real sense of drift in China-Fiji relations. So there was a note of triumphalism there, pointing to a number of successful initiatives that Australia has pursued, etc. You've got a very good eye on this. Do you think that's an accurate assessment, or is that a bit complacent, perhaps?
Perhaps that's what I was alluding to when I said there's been no upping of the ante in the relationship. And I think I use the word consolidation because I think they're trying to bed down some things and perhaps keep hold of some of the gains that have been advanced. I'm talking about Fiji and China, both of them. But perhaps you're right, there has been some drift, and COVID has been part of the problem here. It's just not enabled perhaps the interactions that there might have been, or the momentum that might have been there before. But certainly, even before COVID, we saw, I think, a changing of the relationship vis-a-vis Fiji's dependence on China and its closeness that was, you know, evident with its relations with other countries. Maybe this foreign minister's visit is part of the attempt to redirect it. There actually has not been any or much commentary here about the visit. They might get coverage when it happens, but there's been not much in the lead up to the visit.
I think we can be guaranteed that Richard Naidu will start tweeting about motorcades and traffic holdups and berating people on Twitter. So at least then we might get a bit of global attention.
Well, if that's the case, he will be. We had the Australian Governor General's visit, as you probably know, and that caused quite a lot of disruption.
The poor people of Suva, yeah, every time the motorcade comes into town. Graeme, maybe I'll go to you, particularly on the China angle specifically, and the signalling and strategic intent behind Wang Yi's trip. Were you shocked when you saw yesterday? I suspect you weren't shocked, but are you nonetheless surprised by the scale, scope of this visit, and what do you think it signals exactly, or possibly?
I feel for the 3 countries that were left out. I mean, you know, poor old UA, what's it going to do?
No, they're going to talk on the cloud, which I think means soon. Your Chinese, my Chinese cloud existed, yours is good.
Yeah. Oh, goodness me. No, I didn't expect it to be that many countries. I don't know that anyone had picked that. I think you were guessing 5. I was kind of thereabouts too. And you know, it's for Wang Yi, it's just a day. It's just a a day in the life of Wang Yi. This is what he does all over the planet. It just happens that now we're in the Pacific, so we're going to pay it a lot more attention. But this is pretty well what he spends his life doing. Now, what will be interesting to watch is what gifts are given away and what arrangements are signed. I'm sure this is what people are watching very, very closely, not far from here. And that is, we'll wait and see. I mean, Kiribati was the one that surprised me. I thought, given the optics of COVID back in China, where Shanghai is still under lockdown and Beijing kind of has this creeping on and off again lockdown, where the urbanites are finally getting a taste of what their regime is, which rural people have been experiencing for years. I thought in the light of that, it would be unlikely they would go to Kiribati. So that was probably the big surprise for me. I mean, sure, 4 hours, sure, we'll wear whatever gear. But yeah, there's going to be a hard one to sell back home. To go to a country that's in lockdown seems quite extraordinary.
Transform, I'm sorry again, so that I missed your opening address due to my lateness, but I might bring you in now if that's all right. In particular on the Solomon Islands leg and the relationship of Wang Yi's trip and the relationship between China and Solomon Islands. What's your expectation of what potentially might come out of this trip? Obviously, there's been an announcement from the government of Solomon Islands with the Chinese embassy that a number of high-level agreements will be signed. We don't yet know what those are. Do you have any sense of what might be signed? And what do you make of the arrival of the Prime Minister in Honiara?
Yeah, thank you. I think just judging from the Prime Minister's statement yesterday and today, that there is a heightened expectation, and I think the government of Prime Minister Songkraware is looking forward to meeting with the Foreign Minister. From what I understand, there's going to be a number of MOUs that are going to be signed. And unfortunately, the public have not really seen the contents of these MOUs, except those that have been leaked out in the media. And so we really don't know how many MOUs are going to be signed. But just speaking personally, as a Solomon Islander, I think for me, this represents an important threshold in the relationship, in the growing relationship that we have with China. As you know, China is an important trading partner for Solomon Islands, and so to that extent, I think this is going to cement some of those aspects of the relationship. I drove past the Chinese embassy yesterday, and I saw there's a lot of activities going on there. I think one of the things that will come up is the fact that we had riots last year in November, which targeted the Chinese, and so there's a lot of this underlying current that's going on in the country and in the capital. This unease about the security agreement that we have, but it's water under the bridge in the sense that it has been initialed and it has been signed. But because of the riots that we had, and also the fact that I think that relationship with China, there's still some elements of unease, particularly in Malaita. So there's these things that are going on, which will take time, I think, for our relationship to mature and grow. But the fact that we've got the Foreign Minister of China visiting at this particular point in time, to me, signals the value that they attach to the relationship with Solomon Islands. And so I think that in itself is an important indicator of where things are going to be at with Solomon Islands, China, and also with Australia, and also the United States. So it's interesting because the security agreement with Solomon Islands and China has probably shaken up given a lot of attention to the Pacific again from the Western countries, and so probably had to take that kind of arrangement to reshape the region again. Yeah, so thanks.
Yeah, thank you. Can I ask you, I might stick with you if that's all right, please, sir. A two-part question related to that. A lot of theories have been swirling about what the ultimate aim of this pact may or may not be. A lot of speculation, obviously, about a military presence down the track potentially. The two alternate theories that have also been cycled of one, that Prime Minister Manasseh Sogavare sees the potential to ask the Chinese police in particular to provide something of a Praetorian guard down the track. Or two, that there's a desire from the Chinese government, perhaps driven by perhaps shopkeepers and members of the diaspora in Honiara, for better protection given the ravages of the riots last year. So another theory that's only one that's kicked around is that perhaps Chinese police could be asked to effectively provide a level of protection. Whether or not that would be precipitated potentially by another crisis or not is a separate question. What do you think of those two theories, sir? Do you think they're plausible? And in terms of Australia, sorry for the double-barreled question, obviously the current government, the new government, has unveiled new migration pathways to Australia for Pacific Island nations, some 3,000. The government seems to be of the view that trying to bind Australia and Pacific Island nations together more tightly through not just Pacific labour mobility programs, but also migration pathways could be a crucial strategic step to take. Do you think that this is a smart approach, and do you think it may pay dividends?
First of all, I'll go to the report of Australia, which I think is a wonderful approach. And I think personally, I would really like to see a lot more integration between Australia and the Pacific Island countries. And I wish that this had been done before. I would really love to have seen, as Michael Somari probably said, the localization program was probably rushed a bit. Australian teachers teaching in our schools and Australian doctors working in our hospitals. That's something that I would really love to be able to see, that level of integration. After all, we are very much part of the same region, and therefore, I've always personally argued that it should be easy for us to come to Australia, than it is for us to go to Asia. And so I really welcome the shift in and the announcement by the Labour government of its policy. I think it's on the right track. In that sense, therefore, I also would like to see, in terms of the security arrangement, that there should be some coherence. I think Australia and the West should work together with China and also work with the Solomon Islands government to ensure that there's coherence in the security arrangements that we have. We've had a long established relationship with Australia in developing not just our defense, but also the police force. And so, the argument that bringing in another force can potentially create confusion. But I think where our energies should be directed towards should be to actually help build the capacity of the Royal Solomon Islands Police Force. And this is where both Australia and China, if they can support with equipment. I am opposed to the notion of having actually armed Chinese personnel come in specifically to protect their diaspora. I think that to me is that's the role and function of the Royal Solomon Islands Police Force. And so Australia, US, and the others can actually work together. I was hoping that they would. When we switched to China, I was hoping that we would see a more Solomon Islands could be able to play a role that brings China and US and Australia together to help with the security arrangements of the Pacific, and so on and so forth. So, yeah, thanks.
Thank you. Denghua, I might bring you in now, please. I'll ask this question to both Denghua and Graeme. I think that point there from Transform about trying to get some coherence in terms of any potential security cooperation between Pacific Island countries, Australia, and potentially China, should we see a more sort of significant presence of Chinese police, for example, in the region, is a really interesting one, because I know there's a lot of uncertainty or skepticism in Canberra about how coordinating with Chinese police, for example, on the ground in a place like Solomon Islands, and simultaneously, of course, with the RSIPF and the Solomon Islands government, it presents some really fraught and difficult challenges should that eventuate. And no one seems very sure about how exactly we would approach that, because it would obviously present some real difficulties, particularly given the state of the relationship between Australia and China right now. Graeme and Denghua, can I ask, perhaps I'll start with you, Denghua, do you think that that is something that could be arranged with any level of ease, or do you think it would present real challenges to the Chinese system potentially, as well as the Australian system?
So Stephen, are you talking about the potential coordination between the, let's say, the Australian the police force and the Chinese police force on the ground in Solomon Islands, right?
Yes, correct. In Solomon Islands, or potentially in other countries, should security agreements be struck down the line, which is something that people are speculating about, but no one has hard evidence, of course.
Sure. I think for this one, I think personally, I think it should be the role of the Solomon Islands government. They should play this type of coordinating role. And in terms of I think let's say the potential coordination or even cooperation between let's say the Chinese police force and Australian police force on the ground in the Pacific, I think my personal view is that it could be quite difficult. Yeah, I can use the example of the coordination between the Australian aid program and the Chinese aid program in the Pacific as an example, because my research has focused largely on this type of the trilateral aid cooperation, and the finding that it's really difficult for the different types of let's say different type of donors, especially the donors like China, and then donors like the traditional OECD donors to sit down together and do some kind of the coordination and cooperation. And from the Chinese side, to be frank, and they are very reluctant even to attend those roundtable discussions organized by the traditional donor states. But if those type of the roundtables are organized by let's say the Pacific Island governments, it is more possible that the aid officials will turn up. So my point is that I think it will be up to the Solomon Islands government or the governments in the other Pacific Island countries to coordinate.
Yeah, that's interesting. I will come to you, Graeme, but just to draw you out further on that, Selja, Q&A and you 2 weeks ago, Graeme, it feels like 16 years ago.
Another era.
Yeah, a different era, said that he was basically very skeptical of the possibility of any further coordination or cooperation between China and Australia in terms of ODA, Overseas Development Assistance efforts. He acknowledged that programs like the malaria program and PNG exist, but he said, look, paraphrasing, given the state of the relationship between Australia and China, those programs may linger on, but the prospect of any new initiatives being pursued is very, very slim. Do you share that assessment that further cooperation or coordination between the PRC and Australia in the Pacific when it comes to ODA is made difficult, perhaps, if not impossible, by the current state of the bilateral relationship?
So a question for me, right?
Yes, please. Sorry.
Yeah, I think that one quick point I want to add is that I think for this type of the coordination and the cooperation, and to me, I think the number one issue is this type of the political trust between especially between the governments involved, such as the Australian government and the Chinese government and then the Pacific Island governments. And again, I think because I've done a lot of research on the China, Australia, and PNG malaria trilateral project, and my finding is that I think the political endorsement and the political trust from the three governments is a key to the initiation and also to the implementation of this type of the the aid coordination and cooperation. And if countries, I think they have strong, let's say, strategic, let's say the mistrust, I think it is extremely difficult for them to conduct this type of the cooperation and coordination, let's say.
All right, thank you. Graeme, I'm going to dive back very slightly to that question I first asked. Sorry, I'm going back and forth here a bit. But that prospect of potentially, and I know we're to some extent getting ahead of ourselves, but we have seen a Chinese training team already in Honiara, so in that sense, boots are to some extent on the ground. How would Australia approach this prospect of trying to coordinate, and particularly given that sovereignty for this lies within the hands of the Solomon Islands government and the RSIPF, do you think China would be willing to do what Australia has done and essentially subordinate, at least notionally, Chinese police to the RSIPF? That's what some MPs in Solomon Islands say they expect. Is that plausible? And how would Australia, Solomon Islands and China begin to coordinate, given the geopolitical currents swirling around an arrangement like that?
Yeah, like that really is the nub of it. And I think, I mean, I slightly disagree. Even on the Australian side, they're not really subordinate.
Right.
They have to
Notionally,
but they have to coordinate with the Solomon Islands Police Force, but they're certainly not under the command of the Solomon Islands Police Force when they're in country. And indeed, should anything go wrong, as it has at least in one case over the years in Solomon Islands, the problem of extraterritoriality kind of comes into it in terms of who's responsible for when something goes wrong with the police force. I can't see, I mean, we haven't seen the final text of the agreement between the PRC and SOLS, but the initial draft that was leaked by someone in this room, I am,
looking at the culprit.
Thank you for the service to
services in the interest of transparency.
Absolutely. No, but in the very vague initial draft, which appears to be kind of a pared down version of Australia's Solomon Islands agreement, with all the detail and all the caveats taken out and just made incredibly vague. It's not clear at all whether they'd be under the command of the RSIP. So it's going to be such an interesting situation. One of my PhD students, Pete Connolly, has basically written about this, and he calls it the danger of accidental friction, because he's led similar missions in Solomon Islands. And one of the biggest surprises he got way back in 2000 was when he got a list of people that they were going to rescue in country, or expats they were meant to be taking away during the unrest. He got one list, which was basically a bunch of Anglo names, and then the next day he got another list, and suddenly the majority of the names were Chinese names. So this thing that came out that the Australians were not going to protect Chinese citizens on the ground, that has been put forward by that will now put forward by the Prime Minister.
The Prime Minister repeatedly,
and
consistently, angrily.
And it's for those who operate in these operations, it's quite extraordinary that they would, it may be that the diplomat says something unwise, but how can you distinguish? Like, there are Australian people with Chinese faces as well. You can say, well, I'm not going to protect you because you're not white. And yeah, there's a whole range of complicated issues. We are getting ahead of ourselves, but the danger of two police forces basically operating unto themselves in a third country, Solomon Islands, that could get messy.
I'm going to look a little bit broader now and touch on climate policy, which is, I know, not necessarily a huge focus in some of these chapters, but it's an intriguing question, at least it is to me. The new Labor government has signalled very closely, of course, that climate policy is a shift in climate policy. We now have some more ambition. Pacific Island states will probably see it as modest ambition at best, but nonetheless, it's higher than it was. And Senator Penny Wong and Anthony Albanese are saying that this offers an opportunity to really refresh Australia's relationships with the Pacific. Now, coalition MPs have repeatedly scoffed at this idea, because they say any idea that we gain more strategic heft in the Pacific by boosting our ambition in climate change is naive, because of course China is self-evidently the world's largest polluter, and yet look what's happened in Solomon Islands, etc., etc. Graeme, I might go to you again on this next, and then go to some other panelists in a short period of time we sadly have left. What do you make of that argument? Do you think Australia's, I mean, leaving aside the moral question and moral obligations facing Australia around climate policy, taking a really narrow, I guess, geopolitical lens, do you think that Labor's commitments on climate policy will boost its stocks substantially in the Pacific? And what relevance does this have when it comes to contestation with China, given China's own record on climate?
Yeah, so I mean, the leading Pacific document on security is the Boe Declaration, and it puts climate change #1, front and center.
Then daylight, right?
Then daylight in terms of what our security concerns, because it's an existential concern. So it does make a huge difference. Now, what they will do domestically, it's hard to say. And I think in terms of the China factor, a lot of scales for many people in the region kind of fell away at Glasgow when China backed language around coal. It's evident at that point, oh gosh, actually, these guys are just as addicted to coal as the LNP. In fact, far more so. They're actually still building plants. They're still, willing to water down Glasgow. So I think thinking has shifted a little bit on
Someone argued to me that Frank Bainimarama's attitude to China, now perhaps more lukewarm than it was a little while ago, was driven in large part, or perhaps in some part, by China's climate policies. I have no idea if that's true. It's an intriguing possibility.
Look, Frank hasn't called me on the phone recently.
No, not really. Frank loves calling ABC journalists. He has a great regard for our organisation.
Up there with Australian diplomats.
Yeah, about the same. All right, I might bring, actually, I might bring transforming at this point, actually. So what do you make of the impact of climate policy? Do you think Labor's commitments will make a material difference in terms of its diplomatic stature and strategic stocks in the Pacific, or are Pacific Island nations likely to look at Labor and say, look, you're still exporting coal, thermal coal by the shipload. Your targets don't meet 1.5, even though they are an improvement. And do you think it's inevitable that after a short break, Pacific Island nations will simply continue to ramp up the pressure?
That's an interesting and probably difficult question to answer, because on the one hand, we've got a lot of people coming to work in Australia, as part of the seasonal labour scheme. But then on the other hand, you've got this announcement by Labor that we will be working together on climate change. So perhaps maybe it's a bit too early to make any assessment or critique of where Australia's climate change policy would be, because that would remain to be seen. And where it will be seen, of course, will be in its behavior towards reducing its coal usage, over achieving its the targets that it will set for itself. And if there's a pathway that Pacific Island countries see that there is actually a commitment, then I think they would be happy to go along with that. For me, the early signals are quite a positive one that we're seeing around the region from social media and comments that I've seen about the new government in Australia. So I think the jury is still out there. Let's give them time to respond. And I think, given all that's happened, that they will be taking their commitment serious. That's my.
All right. I've hogged far too much time with my own questions. I'm a greedy journalist. That's what we do. I apologise. Do we have any questions from the audience? Do we have a roving microphone? Okay. Well, I've got a question from online. From Bernard. To Denghua, from your observation, what is the main aim of the Chinese foreign minister's diplomatic visit to the region? Do you think he'll move China's relations with the countries that he's visiting to another level? And do you think it will make it difficult for the new Labor government in Australia to compete for influence?
Sure. And thank you, Bernard, for this question. I think in terms of the Chinese foreign minister, one is the visit to the region. Let me give you some kind of the background, which I hope can be useful. And for the foreign minister Wang's upcoming visit to the whole region, I think to me it's not surprising. This is not unprecedented, because if we look back, we can see that actually in the year 2006, that is actually, to be more specific, that is between July and August 2006. At that time, the Chinese foreign minister, Li Zhaoxin, Foreign Minister Li, he also paid a visit to all the Pacific Island countries that diplomatically recognized China. And so that's not a totally new theme. And the main purpose for that visit in the year 2006 was to consolidate the China-Pacific relationship, especially at that time, after the Chinese Premier Wen Jiabao paid a historic visit to Nandi, Fiji in April 2006. And also during that visit, the Chinese side, they announced the establishment of the China-Pacific Islands Economic Cooperation and Development Forum, and also announced the provision of large amounts of the concessional loans to the whole region. And for the Foreign Minister Wang Yi's visit, I think his visit comes at a very interesting time. That is, we have seen that the Pacific region is increasingly getting caught up in the geostrategic competition. So look at what's happening. I think, let's say, look at the recent Quad summit in Japan. So I think there are at least two purposes for the Chinese Foreign Minister Wang Yi to visit the region. The first is to demonstrate that China cares about the region. And I expect that the Chinese side will sign, the China and the Pacific Island partners they will sign a lot of the cooperation agreement. And I think the second purpose of his visit, how to say, is like a response to the geostrategic competition, especially the traditional powers increased investment in the region. And in terms of the second part of the question, do you think he will move China's relationship to the Pacific, with the Pacific to a new level? I think back in the year 2014, when the Chinese the President Xi Jinping visited the region, the two sides has already agreed to elevate their relationship to they call it a comprehensive strategic partnership. I think that's the highest level in terms of the relationship between China and the partner countries. And yeah, and I assume that during the visit, the Foreign Minister Wang Yi will also discuss the security issues, not only with Solomon Island governments, but also with the rest of the Chinese Pacific partners in the region. Because as we know that some of the Pacific Island countries, they have also expressed concern about the China Solomon Island Security Compact and the implications for the whole region. So I'm sure that the Foreign Minister Wang Yi will use this opportunity to pacify the other Pacific Island partners. I will stop here.
Thank you. Any questions from the floor or online? Yes, I think one is gentleman in the white shirt, and then.
Thank you. I had a brief question, maybe for Graeme, but if anyone else wants to ask. In talking about the China-Solomon Island Security Agreement, looking at the Prime Minister himself, he's obviously been in national politics for a long time. And one thing I've been pondering is the effect that the Ramsey operation might have had on his decision-making regarding the China Security Agreement. So do you think that Solomari's experiences with Ramsey, of which he was at times critical, might have had an impact on his decision-making to create a closer security arrangement with China?
Maybe Graeme and then transform, or transform
Maybe
first.
transform first, yeah.
Maybe transform first, sir, and then Graeme. Transform, do you have any response to that question? Oh, have we lost him?
Oh, we've lost him.
Oh, that's a shame because he's so perfectly positioned to reflect on exactly that question. Never mind. Graeme, you'll have to do.
Look, I'm not sure if James is still in the room with us, so I'm a bit nervous talking about Ramsey. We'll see the former special coordinator in the room, but here. Look, I mean, he's been PM 4 times, and peculiarity of the Solomon system is never consecutively. This just seems to be the way way it works themselves. You never get re-elected ever. But having been Prime Minister 4 times, he's built up a fair bit of scar tissue, I think it's fair to say. And if I was to pick out one particular incident that seems to have shaken him somewhat and made him possibly not as stable to Australia, it would have been around the Motti affair, when his officers were searched without him being present. That would probably be the number one. And yeah, interestingly enough, on my podcast, which kind of got me in a little bit of hot water, he mentioned as his number one exhibit A why it was worth switching from Taiwan to China. He cited an example of the Australians putting the kibosh on a police cooperation arrangement with Taiwan, and he reflected, and now it seems quite interestingly that China would never allow that to happen. They would push back and push back effectively. Yes, I think you had a question.
I do. Sorry to ask a question when I asked one earlier. I've just received information that journalists in one of the countries that the Chinese foreign minister is about to visit in the coming little while are concerned about restrictions that are being placed on their reporting of that visit. Maybe Denghua can tell us what can we expect in terms of the time that the Chinese foreign minister is going to spend in the region. What can we expect in terms of availability to the press, and what constraints may be put on journalists that want to cover those events?
Maybe one for Sandra as well.
Yeah, maybe Sandra and Denghua. And I think I've got some information on that actually here, Tess, as well, which I'll try and pull up while they answer that. Denghua, do you want to go first?
Sure, maybe, how to say, very briefly. I think that, yeah, I'm not sure during the Wang Yi's visit, whether let's say, the local journalists, the Pacific Island journalists will be allowed to attend all those, the high level meetings between Wang Yi and his Pacific counterparts, and also those senior Pacific leaders. And I remember that during the APEC summit, there are some stories that some of the Pacific Island journalists complained that they were not allowed to attend some of those the high level events. And so, sorry, I do not have an answer to this one.
I might have a bit of information on that actually, Tess, but it's my Wi-Fi isn't working. But it does seem like in Solomon Islands, at least, there might be a boycott which is being organised as of a couple of hours ago because of some problems around access. But I'll try and get more details. I suspect that's the same thing you're talking about. Yeah. Now we've got a question coming in for Sandra, I think it is. Sandra, you mentioned anti-Chinese sentiment from Rebecca Prasad. I see. I'm sorry, I misunderstood. So you mentioned before that members of the opposition who may well come into power have some skepticism towards China. But have they given any indication how Fiji's policy towards China would change if they actually win the forthcoming election and form a government? That's a great question. Sandra, do you have any clues on that?
No, I don't think we've seen any actual manifestos from the opposition. So whether or not it comes into it, I don't know. I mean, foreign policy generally is not an election issue here. But yes, there have been in the past claims by both the head of SADC, well, he's not there now, Ramuka and Biman Prasad, alleging, well, they feel our government has become too close to China. This is compromising our ability to criticize China or to speak out on issues like human rights. But of course, they are very critical of our own government, as you know, and they're the sort of the tendencies within this government to curtail or constrain the opposition and any kind of some sort of freedom. So I think we will have to wait and see what will happen. It's possible that these sorts of claims, these sorts of criticisms made now will not necessarily be followed through. It's quite possible that things will shift again. So to be honest, we don't know. I mean, and as I said, there's been no manifesto released yet that will show what their policies might be in respect to China or anyone else for that matter.
All right, I think it was Siobhan next.
Yeah, thank you. And thank you so much for what's been a really fabulous panel. I'm going to do something just slightly cheeky, which is stretch back to the previous panel a little and some of the themes from that to ask the question. What I want to do is just talk about what I think is another set of issues which I think are causing some of the fracturing through some of the regional architecture at the moment. And that is really what Nick McClellan touched on in some of what he was presenting. And I think this is really, from my perspective, as someone who negotiates internal to some of these regional structures, are these issues of oceanic sovereignty that come up. So we know that in terms of what Nick was raising, in terms of the Kanak independence movement, FLKS, but also the long-running issue of West Papua, the Melanesian Spearhead Group, and these regional issues. So we've got the ALP moving forward. We know that Anthony Albanese has said that the first country he wants to visit now is Indonesia. And I think this is a real issue to table as we see geopolitics playing out, as we see these various sets of kind of alliances forming. I think often broader Pacific sovereignty movements are overlooked. So I really wanted to ask the broader panel to come in on some of those questions. Thank you.
Graeme, do you want to start on that one, or maybe Sandra? Yeah, that one.
I'm sorry, I couldn't hear very well. I might have to pass on that.
It was a question about our broader questions of sovereignty, including on New Caledonia, but also the question of Papua, and in the context of Australia's relationship with Indonesia. I think Siobhan just wanted to dwell on some of those, or bring some reflections in about how that plays into some of these core questions.
If Nick is here, maybe Nick could respond.
Yeah, Nick has reappeared.
Oh, Nick's reappeared.
Yeah.
Technological wizardry. Nick, did you hear Siobhan then, or were you offline?
No, I was listening, and I clicked on because I think this is a really significant challenge at the moment for the AUKUS partners, where the question of self-determination in Melanesia is very much on the regional agenda through the Melanesian Spearhead Group and the Pacific Islands Forum. The move towards a new political status in Bougainville, particularly in New Caledonia, the ongoing self-determination struggle in West Papua is a complex, sensitive, but immediate question for the region, and will be discussed at the forthcoming Pacific Islands Forum in July because of the forum mission to report on New Caledonia's referendum. In terms of China's role, it's contradictory. The days when the Chinese Communist Party supported colonized peoples and the right to independence is long gone. The capitalist roaders in Beijing are very strong on not interfering in internal affairs of other countries. They see particularly France as a counterweight to the United States in some regional global forums. So the support for self-determination is also a sensitive issue given Chinese oppression in Tibet, in Xinjiang, and so on. At the same time, China has interest in resources in the region, the vast maritime zone of French Polynesia, New Caledonia's nickel, quarter of the world's nickel reserves, and so on. And China, as I mentioned in my presentation earlier today, is the largest trading partner for New Caledonia, for French Polynesia. So at that level, China plays an influence. I think the problem is that the media coverage of these areas really is very mechanical. So before the New Caledonia referendum in December 2021, the French press for 2 weeks before the referendum, talked about China, 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 and nothing more. And the Kanak struggle has been going on basically since 1853, a long time before Beijing came onto the scene. And I think, as we've seen with Australian media coverage of the Solomons crisis, it's very much more about these global geopolitical questions than what's happening in the Pacific. And I think this will pose challenges for Australia as under the new government, say it wants to rebuild relations with France. This question of decolonisation in New Caledonia is still very much on the agenda for the Melanesian Spearhead Group, at a time that China is also looking at New Caledonia resources. So it creates a complex situation where Australia has bonded to American strategy through AUKUS, through nuclear submarine purchases and so on. Our Melanesian neighbours still see the self-determination processes as central. And so this is a real tension, I think, in ways that China overlays very deep and complex questions on the ground, particularly in Melanesia.
I'd really like to get into that more. There are so many interesting things that brings up, particularly whether there will be any shift on either of those issues under Labor. Certainly nothing discernible I picked up, but the question, frankly, hasn't really been asked yet. All right, I'm terribly sorry. I'd really like to go to more questions and to dig into some more subjects, but I fear, Graeme, we are out of time. We're all going to turn into pumpkins. It's 1 o'clock. So all I can do now is ask everyone here to please join me in thanking our panelists, including Transform, who sadly, and Denghua, who've dropped off, but Sandra's still there. So please give them a hand in absentia. Thank you, Graeme, as well for organising this panel. It's been fascinating. Apologies again for my lateness, and thanks all for coming. Really appreciate it.